Hello and welcome to NDTV 24/7. I'm Priyanshi Sharma, and today for a change we'll discuss some good news. There have been several pieces of good news for the economy today. We'll talk about them and decode them in this show. First of all, the GDP figures are out and they have exceeded expectations. According to the provisional estimates that have been released by the Government of India, in financial year 2023, the gross domestic product of our country grew by 7.3%, which is higher than the forecast that the government had made earlier at 7%. But the growth rate is lower than the 9.1% growth rate that was recorded in the last financial year. The financial year 2023 GDP growth rate is at 7%, and this maintains India's status as the fastest growing major economy in the world. Now, the quarterly GDP figures are also out and they're also positive. The GDP grew by 6.1% in the January to March quarter, which is higher than the Reserve Bank of India's estimate of 5.9%. And another good news, the central government has also met its fiscal deficit target. The fiscal deficit for the financial year 2023 has narrowed to 6.4% of the GDP compared to 6.7% of the GDP in the last financial year. In simple terms, this is the difference between what the government spends versus what the government receives, and that difference is now at 17 lakh crore rupees in the financial year 2023. And that's not it. American investment banking company Morgan Stanley, in a report, has said that India has transformed under the Modi government compared to 2013. It says that India has gained a position in the world order and is becoming a key driver for Asia and global growth as well. So definitely major positive news coming in for the Indian economy on several fronts. To decode this, we have a special guest joining us on the broadcast, Mr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, who is the former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and he's currently the Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. Thanks very much, Mr. Subramaniam, for joining us. And my first question to you, good signs clearly showing up. So do you think we've fully recovered from the negative impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war and the pandemic as well, both combined?
Thanks a lot, Priyanshi, and a very good evening to viewers. Yes, not only have we recovered from the twin crisis, but first the once-in-a-century pandemic, and then the Ukraine war. So two black swan events, we've recovered from them, but we've also actually gathered momentum, as can be seen from the numbers. I would like to, to mention that if we look at the revision, on 28th of February, when the advance estimates had come, the GDP growth was estimated to be 7%. It's been revised upwards to 7.2%. If we look at the revisions that happen in these numbers over the last 2 years, next year, around on 28th February, the first revised estimates will come, and then a year after that, the second revised estimates. These are very common, in every country, GDP estimates are revised. I expect that the GDP numbers will be revised even more upwards, because if you look at FY21 and FY22, both these numbers were revised about 1%, in each of these revisions. So I expect growth to be above 7.5%, closer to 8% when the final estimate for this comes. And I think in a global economy which is struggling to grow on average at even, excess of about 1% or so, 7.5% plus closer to 8% is just extremely good. I will contrast this with, how we had done in the previous crisis, the global financial crisis, which was just a demand side shock. India became part of the fragile five. In contrast, now we're actually part of the top five economies, despite a twin shock of both COVID and the Ukraine war.
Well, that sounds really good. 7.5% to 8% is what you're estimating the figures could be revised to. We'll see whether that happens. But you also mentioned the point about the global comparison. So India, with these figures, maintains its status as the fastest growing economy in the world. So how do you place India compared to other developed and developing economies currently?
A very good question, Priyanshi. In fact, I would say in the 75-year-old history of India, there hasn't been another period when India has been such a positive outlier on both dimensions, which is macro fundamentals and on growth. We are, if you look at our current account deficit, fiscal deficit, inflation, all the three numbers actually are very well between manageable limits. Inflation is trending down. And growth, is high as well. So there hasn't been another period where we've been such an outlier, in compared to the global economy. I think that goes down to the very sagacious policy that was implemented during COVID. As I've said before, I've written as well. India did well to identify the COVID crisis as a big supply side shock. India was possibly among the only economies to identify that correctly. Therefore, the supply side measures were implemented. And if you would recall, Morgan Stanley's report, the first slide talks about the supply side measures, and that came about only because of the correct identification of the COVID crisis. You have to keep in mind that unlike demand side measures, which, you can give money and they reach immediately in India, in fact, with the click of a button, supply side measures take time. If you have to build infrastructure, you start planning today, the infrastructure comes up with a lag of 1.5 years, even longer. And therefore, the foresight that was displayed by policymakers during COVID, I think, is serving India very well at this point in time.
Right. Interesting that you point out, and in fact, we're putting out those pointers from the Morgan Stanley report as well that says that India has transformed since 2013. But one more point, Mr. Subramanian, here is that while the headline numbers all sound great, do you think this positivity is spread equally for the entire country? Because we see that the value of our GDP nominally has grown over 40% compared to 2019. But that's also because prices grew by over 6% last year. So definitely our pie has gotten bigger, but the piece that each person is getting is still pretty low, isn't it? The per capita income is just around 1,15,000 rupees. That's only grown about 10% in the last 4 years or so.
No, Priyanshi, let me clarify. All these numbers that we spoke about just now were all, adjusted for inflation. These are the growth at 7.2% is not the nominal number. It is the real number. The nominal number is much higher. In fact, is in double digits. But it doesn't make that much economic sense to focus on nominal numbers. Right. The real numbers is where actually the growth has been good. You have to keep in mind, if you again look at the Morgan Stanley report as well, this is not growth that has just gone to the, to the top decile of the income ladder. If you put it together with a very nice, vigorously done paper by Dr. Arvind Panagaria, former Niti Aayog vice chairman, who clearly shows that inequality has declined significantly using high quality PLFS data. And poverty also has actually, especially rural poverty, has declined, amidst COVID. The pace of decline was a little slower in the COVID years, but has declined. So when you look at that, put it together with what Morgan Stanley talks about as well, cash transfers. If you look at compared to, about 2016 or so, when the focus on the digital economy was started, now the digital transactions are orders of magnitude higher. Not just that, the overall, even in-kind transfers are also much higher. And these are all, intended, and they actually go to the bottom of the pyramid. And that is why inequality has come down. Poverty also is trending down. So this is not the usual narrative of, the rich have grown richer. It is actually growth that has also helped in sort of bringing benefits to those people who are actually more vulnerable as well.
Right. Well, Mr. Subramanian, as always, thanks very much for joining us. Pleasure speaking to you. And we will keep our focus on this big story of the day. As Mr. Subramanian pointed out, that this is growth that in many senses has been divided among the large population of the country as well. But let's deep dive into that point a little bit more. And we have Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, the former Finance Secretary of India, joining us. We also have Mr. Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who's a senior economist. And Professor Mehrotra, the point that we were just talking about, that definitely our pie is getting bigger. The nominal GDP is around 272 lakh crore rupees. But our per capita GDP has barely grown in the last 4 years or so. From 2019 to now, it has grown by around 10%. The annual per capita GDP is around 1,15,000 rupees. So do you think there are still certain pain points, certain challenges that are ahead for India as we aim towards that 5 trillion economy for 2027?
So very glad that you began by pointing out per capita income, and per capita income is an average across the whole country. And if we know that if the bottom half of the population and in the workforce has seen joblessness increase, has seen the work participation rate falling, if unemployment has risen and real wages have fallen, then you can imagine how the bottom half is living. And this is actually shown by the CSDS survey, which data for which was just released yesterday, which shows that about, as compared to about 11% of people who were surveyed who said poverty is an issue, now that number has jumped in 2023 to 19%, which is pretty much where Vivek Debaroy, the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council of this government's prime minister, says the poverty rate is. Regardless of what Panagaria might be saying, Panagaria's methodology is wrong, just like Bhalla and Virmani's methodology was wrong. So let's not even begin to talk about these estimates of poverty that these people from the government are putting out. The World Bank, in an official report in 2022 for the poor for the number of poor in the world in 2020, said the following. In an official report, not in some working paper of some economists, which is not even vetted by either the IMF or the World Bank. They said the first year of COVID 2020 saw 70 million people falling below the poverty line of $2.15, of which 80% in the world, of which 80% came from India. So, Subramaniam may say what he wants to, but this government is full of economists who are putting out these kind of numbers. It's good news that the GDP is done well this year. It will not be doing as well next year. As far as the Morgan Stanley report is concerned, let me just make one thing very clear. Morgan Stanley is an investment banking firm.
Right.
Just 6 months ago, they had put out a very upbeat report, as it is, with precious little basis, in fact, about its projections. Now, it's put out an even nicer report telling us about what the wonderful things that the country is doing. Its whole objective is to invite and attract multinationals to put in more FDI into India. So if you cherry pick all the data, as Morgan Stanley equity analysts do, because more than half of the people who are writing that report are equity analysts, there are just a couple of economists in that, then obviously they will tell you that GST collections are rising. What they will not tell you is that because corporate tax rates have come down, the tax to GDP ratio under this government has not risen one bit. They will not tell you that while the organized sector of the economy has recovered, the unorganized sector is in deep crisis.
Right. And Mr. Garg, I see you smiling on all of those answers, and let me come to you on that next. So while all the figures that we have pointed out, they all sound great, and the real GDP figures, we have to give it that it has exceeded all expectations. But where do we go from here on? What are the challenges according to you? We have a target of 5 trillion by 2027, and we currently stand at around $3.5 trillion. So till 2027, we'll have to grow at around 10% nominally for the next 4 years to reach 5 trillion. But do you think that's enough? And do you think these are pain points, as Mr. Mehrotra pointed out?
So, Priyanshi, I think we should take the numbers as they are and as they've been presented in their full perspective rather than selectively. The growth for the year is decent at 7.2%. Quarterly growth is also good at 6% plus. That's reassuring that we have come back and recovered quite a lot from that. But if you look at the 4-year growth, that is, to my mind, very important, because that gives you a sense of where we have come from and where we are going. The 4-year GDP growth, CAGR, is only 3.67%. It is less than 4%. 4-year GVA is only about 3.4%. because of the fact that we got very badly hit thanks to a very unwise lockdown decision to my mind. And we have only made up by now. If you look at a little more closely, the two sectors which have registered good growth in terms of GVA in 22-23 are trade, hospitality, transportation sector one, and the construction is another. The trade sector has grown by about 14%, a very high growth rate. Because it was until last year in the negative as compared to 18-19. It has barely recovered from the lows which it had got dumped into 2021 and 21-22. Even now, with this decent, very high recovery of or growth of 14%, the growth of the trade in the sector is only about 2% over 18-19. The construction growth, which is driving the GDP growth for this year, is largely on account of the government's capex expenditure.
Right.
How sustainable that is on the top of a very high fiscal deficit is something which we need to keep in mind. 47% of the growth which has been registered in 22-23 has come only from these two sectors, trade and trade and construction.
Right.
Mining, we are still not. Can you believe this? Mining, we are still not.
And clearly, manufacturing is also struggling. A 1% growth in manufacturing is not great news.
Manufacturing is struggling very, very badly.
Right.
And the 4-year growth is only less than 3%.
Right.
So I don't think we should be sort of beating the drums about being fastest growing, being whatever this way. We should take the message that we have barely recovered and we'll need to do a lot of hard work for the economy as a whole to really grow. To come back to your question about 5 trillion, the 5 trillion is in relation to the dollar. That's measured in dollar. Inflation got neutralized by the depreciation of dollar. Last year we depreciated quite a lot in the context of dollar, and 3.5 trillion is only about 0.5 trillion higher than the 3 trillion it was in
so that goal depends on several factors there, and I think we can agree that though the headline numbers definitely sound good, definitely some good news, but way to pat our backs on. There's still a lot more to do, and there's still a lot more to deep dive in and find out the real pain points in the economy. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for pointing out the challenges for the Indian economy as we now look ahead to that 5 trillion goal and to growing and becoming one of the, we are already one of the top 5 economies in the world, but to climb up that ladder, there are these challenges that we need to address. Thanks very much for watching.